I'd like to introduce Paul, who is an addiction psychotherapist and consultant. He's worked in the field for over 25 years. He was the clinical director at Cloud's House, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, and also at Crossroads in Antigua. He's the executive director of Outcome Consulting, which is based here in London and I think in Wiltshire as well. And most importantly to me, he was a huge help to me setting up LifeWorks in the early days when I had no idea what I was getting into, and had he told me properly, I definitely would. But I'm still grateful in spite of that. The topic that we've asked Paul to speak on is one that obviously a lot of people are interested in. For me personally, I believe that it is the basis of all addiction and mental health. And fundamentally for me, it's that deep sense of shame. Okay? I'm not good enough, so I need to do or use something to be able to cope. And what Paul will touch on is, where does this come from? How does it manifest itself? And where do you go? I've been a codependent. My saying is, you scratch an addict, you'll find a codependent. My codependency work has been hit and miss over the years, but I trust that everybody will learn something useful from tonight. And so I'll stop babbling and turn over to Paul.
That's years. All our prayers done, paid off. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. I'm aware, I'm obviously feeling a bit nervous. I went to shake some hands and all the blood has gone to my vital organs. My hands are really cold. And I'm rather pleased that I'm going to be doing this talk. And the nice thing, I'm really happy to donate to talk to the LifeWorks Recovery Series. It's one of the things I rather enjoy doing, it's sort of annual event for me. And one of the nicest parts of it is that I'm not talking at a conference where I might stand behind a podium and just read my notes out. There's something about, I can sort of connect with you here, I hope. And codependency is so much about disconnection, and recovery from codependency is so much about connection. I can also sort of move around a bit and manage my anxiety, which is also feels quite good. It's been great. I was saying to Don before, a few minutes ago, I'm fascinated. I'm very passionate about addiction. I'm fascinated in codependency. But one of the nice things about having to prepare a talk, which actually I haven't really done this before, I talked in treatment centres and vaguely around it, but actually I put quite a bit of thinking into this. And one of the really nice things is there's something about, to the extent to which you teach something, to the extent to which you know something. And it felt a bit like, you sort of keep what you have by giving it away, which might be a familiar phrase to some of you. So it's been a good experience for me. I hope it is for you. The other thing about...
do you think you could speak up a bit?
Or use the mic.
Okay, I could. I'd rather not use a microphone, but I will speak up. Is that a bit better if I do that?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for saying that. I just don't really want to be managing a microphone and holding all the papers. But,
So we'll get the movie.
okay, maybe at times I'll get closer to it. Yeah, I mean, the other thing about it, if I've got lots of adrenaline and cortisol in me at the moment, one of the things that's likely to happen, you may know that in slightly traumatized situations, it affects the part of the brain that mediates time. So what is likely to happen is that this is going to be over in an instant in my mind, and you might be looking at your watch in an hour's time thinking, bloody hell, he's still talking. So there we go. So I just want to sort of talk at you. My aim is to just stimulate thought. I've no idea really. I mean, the difficulty is if I'm talking at a recovery conference or something. I've been talking to therapists. My guess is that I'm talking to some therapists here. I know there's at least one psychiatrist in the audience. I imagine I'm talking to a lot of 12-steppers. I'm certainly going to be talking to people who are concerned with personal growth. I don't know if I'm going to pitch it right. Some of you may think there's too much information. Some of you may feel there isn't enough. And I think one of the things you can do is this talk will be up on the LifeWorks website if you feel you've missed something. And if you feel, I guess, if it wasn't worthwhile, you haven't got a handout that you feel guilty about throwing away or something in the end. So I'm fascinated. I trained as an addictions counsellor over 25 years ago. I'm fascinated in addiction, but I spent 13 years working in primary treatment, doing, what at the time I guess was more like sort of denial bashing. And what I've become fascinated in now is that what happens during the course of recovery. Because we're seeing people, like Don saying, celebrating 30 years, we know so much more now than we did 25 years ago. About addiction and about recovery. So much more. 25 years ago it was only just coming out of being about alcohol and drugs. Since then we've had the process addictions, we've had the ideas of codependence. It's been informed by traumatology. Words like shame weren't around, anxiety was around, but wasn't talked about a whole lot. There wasn't a lot of systemic thinking in terms of families and all of that. Things have really changed, and I'm fascinated by what happens to people in the course of recovery, because we also know that there's never just one addiction. In the course of recovery, people are going to find they're going to come across more and more addictions, and we also realise that there's a concept of addiction interaction, that actually for some people you've got two addictions playing off against each other. And actually what I suspect is that for everybody in recovery, everybody is on a continuum, is on an addiction spectrum, whether it's the work addictions, whether it's the financial addiction of debt, debting, spending, under-earning, whether it's the eating disorders, whether it's the sex and love addictions. I think everybody's going to find that they're on a spectrum somewhere. And everybody's individual, and in a sense we have a sort of what we talk about as an addiction fingerprint. So that notions of powerlessness, of loss of control, failed attempts to control, preoccupation, all the things that define addiction, increases in tolerance, the impacts on things costing people more than they can afford. All that is the same for everybody, but actually the fingerprint is different. And I wanted to talk about, actually it wasn't my idea, I talked about codependence. When I've done the talk I did last year, it was on the couple relationship that really fascinates me in recovery, because people get into all sorts of muddles. And my pet topic is sort of pre-verbal early wounds, and in particular adoption, or the relinquishment wound that leads to adoption, because adoptees are really overrepresented in addiction treatment programs. But anyway, they said, would you do codependency? So that's what I'm doing. And my next one I'd like to use for the financial addictions, because I think that really is fascinating, and I cannot work out why Debtors Anonymous is not the biggest fellowship. It's probably the slowest growing recovery program. Presumably it has something to do with issues of shame and disclosure, but I think that's just astonishing in this day and age. So I'd like to be able to do something for that. And I can look at my notes from time to time to remind myself, but if you were here last year, I'd usually lose myself completely in the middle, and we have little pause when I work out where I'm. So, codependence is an integral part of the recovery movement. I wrote a little bit of blurb for this talk, and I found myself, when I was thinking about it, that this really is fascinating, because codependence is so much about, insecurity and self-doubt. How interesting that of all the conditions, that actually, this should be the one in which there is so much confusion and so much disagreement. So, what I hope to do during the course of the evening, which hopefully will not last for more than an hour of me talking at you, I want to offer a bit of a sort of working definition of codependence, bearing in mind, you can ask, there are as many definitions as there are people that you ask. I want to say something about the history of codependence, in itself, because it's not, interestingly, most of the other addictions are classified as diseases. If you look at, the Americans use a manual called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Otherwise, over here we use something called the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases. Substance misuse, alcohol misuse, actually the gambling addictions, even the debting addictions you can be construed as impulse disorders, the food, the eating disorders, sex addiction stuff is getting in there, but actually codependence isn't, which is interesting. and I'll try and talk a bit about that. I want to talk about where codependence comes from. I'd like to link it to the addictions, but perhaps most importantly, say something about recovery from codependence. What I don't want to end up doing is being like so many self-help books that you get to the penultimate page, you know everything about the condition or how it works, and don't have a clue about what you're going to do next, other than perhaps buy the next self-help book in the hope that, which collect, in my experience, half read on the shelves. So some definitions. What I want to suggest to you is that codependence is about an addiction to security at all costs. I want to suggest to you that it's about people putting ourselves at ease, managing anxiety, putting ourselves at ease by putting others at ease, or in some situations, managing anxiety and putting ourselves at ease by putting others at dis-ease. And I'll come back to that. Okay? In many ways, it's the point, codependence, I believe that it's behind all the addictions. I think it's the point that people come to when they stop acting out with their chemical and their process addictions. I think that, and Pia Melody talks about it being these, the child in the adult body, she says. I also like the expression is codependency is the disease behind the disease. I think that's an important one. But people know it, we think about it as being, it's often talked about as being the hole in the soul. I also think that, to put it very, and actually in Pia Melody also talks about it being a disease of immaturity, which always seems slightly name-calling to me, but actually I think sometimes that's part of what we have to face. But that actually it's about childhood maldevelopment through suboptimal parenting, to name where it comes from. So I can say to you, look, this is about an addiction to security at all costs, but actually, let's not mess around. What this is about is childhood maldevelopment as a consequence of suboptimal parenting. I'm going to say more about that and how that works. Okay. The history of codependence. The recovery movement, I think, likes to think, perhaps slightly narcissistically, that it sort of owns codependence and it sort of works it all out when it comes to that. But it's not entirely true. The analysts, the analytic movement, actually were looking at this in what they call passive-dependent personality. So for those of you that are therapists, if I mention some names, Karen Horney, who's a psychoanalyst, read an awful lot about this, a passive-dependent personality. The family therapists, who I'll talk about later, can actually come in and really inform the thinking about codependence. The family therapists also were really, that they were understanding all of this, with all the systemic thinking, the ideas that actually what happens, how people develop in a family happens. There's so much that happens within the system, that people don't just exist alone. But actually the history of the term, you probably know, comes about that in Minnesota, the birthplace of 12-step recovery treatment, the partner of the alcoholic was referred to as the co-alcoholic. That with the development of 12-step recovery treatment, actually people started talking, as you know, about chemical dependence, which would include all mood-altering chemicals rather than just alcohol. And the partner of the chemically dependent person became the co-dependent. So it's in a sense, this is one of those conditions that was named before it was completely defined, because actually, as I hope to go on and tell you, that actually this is far more than being Mr. or Mrs. Addict. This is far more than that. The movement, the history of the movement has come about, in a way it's sort of phenomenological, that actually people in recovery, clinicians, researchers, observing people in recovery have been starting to try and make sense of what is happening. I think that, within the treatment centres and within the recovery movement. People with sustainable recoveries from their process or their chemical addictions, finding them thinking, well, my goal was to be clean and sober, or my goal was to stop acting out with my sex or my money or my food, but actually, no, it's happened. I feel pretty like shit. There's something, what is this about? This wasn't how I thought it was going to be. Once the pink cloud of early recovery is worn out, it's actually, there's something here, I've connected to something. And people trying to understand that. And I think my interest in this subject's come about by trying to understand why some people end up coming into treatment so many times. You know, the revolving door. And, you know, I'm pretty confident that actually, and because we've been a bit behind in this country, although I think we've massively caught up, you know, treatment has been so much about alcohol and drug addiction. I think that the people that are coming into treatment over and over again are coming in because of their untreated codependency and actually because of their process addictions that so often get missed. And I think in our profession, 10 or 15 years ago, very often, if people had other addictions, we'd sort of say something in some rather collusive way, like, let's just look, I think that needs to be looked at later. You know? And you know, and I look back and I remember meeting somebody that was in treatment. When I started, I did my trainings at an addictions counsellor. I trained at Cloud's House 25 years ago, possibly a bit longer. And I worked there for about 13 years, and I remember meeting somebody. The great thing about the 12-step field actually is because they have these reunions and everything, and people come back. By the way, it's not for the patients, it's so the staff can feel that somebody gets better. but I remember talking to somebody who we treated who was telling me that actually, you know, she'd been in the room with all these other girls, and they'd been out and they'd buying sugar, and they were spooning sugar into their mouths, and, you know, and all this stuff that was just sort of getting missed, let alone the people with compulsive masturbation and all the sexual acting out and stuff that goes on in the treatment centres. So it's a lot of, we've learned a lot. But behind all of this, what I want to suggest to you is codependency. So there's a lot of people, and you'll know the names. I'm going to be talking about some of the researchers and clinicians. Most of you will have read the books. You'll know about Peter Melody, Melody Beattie, and Robin Norwood, and a bunch of them. And I'll mention a few other names for therapists who might be interested in all this stuff. But I think this has been around for a long time. Dr. Van der Kolk, who works at the Meadows, works with Peter Melody. You know, he's pretty sure that most of the time it's codependence, which is very often being misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder. There's a lot of thoughts that a lot of people with codependence end up being diagnosed with ADHD rather than codependence. And I think in many cases, what we see as codependence actually is probably a post-traumatic stress disorder, a developmental post-traumatic stress disorder from childhood. But let's just talk a bit more about the history of the movement. So you know the stories about, I imagine most of you, about the development of 12-step sort of fellowships. You know, that AA starts in 1935. By the end of the 30s, it's written its book. There's 100 members, white middle-class male, most of them. Some of them who still managed to have wives that were sticking around, had wives that met together and formed sort of Al-Anon. Out of that came Al-Anon, came the sort of the children, and there was Alateen that was very much part of Al-Anon. And then in the 50s, you got the guys that weren't drinking anymore, but actually were doing a lot of drugs. And I think about 1953, the birth of Narcotics Anonymous. Later, sort of in the 70s, we're starting to talk about some of the fellowships that deal with sex addictions, the eating, Debtors Anonymous. Some of that stuff's starting to come online. But I think what needs to be acknowledged is that a lot of what got codependence going came from the Alateens. Because in the 1970s, the guys who'd been in Alateen were becoming adults. And they were under the umbrella of Al-Anon. I hope I'm making sense for people who don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe some people who aren't 12-steppers, so it can be rather confusing. And it is hard to pitch this. But the people, the Alateens who became adults were suddenly, you know, wait a minute. You know, in Al-Anon, people are talking about how do you live, you know, how do you manage yourself and regulate your feelings when you're around somebody who's crazily acting out with alcohol or drugs. And what these guys who are coming of age starting to say, well, you know what, actually, why should we be trying to regulate how we feel? Actually, we realised that there's a whole lot of stuff that was happening to us when we were growing up. You know, actually, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of abuse, there was a lot of neglect. And they started to form, so in 1978, I think it was, in New York, adult children of alcoholics formed. And they started to think about what was really going on for them. And some of the things that you then hear about in the adult children of alcoholics movement, some of the family rules, starting to talk about don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, the sort of stuff that you hear the adult children's alcoholics. Now, also in the 70s, you had Pia Melody was working at the Meadows. She's very open about her story, so I have never a problem disclosing it to you. You know, acting out, she was in quite a difficult space. They had a problem with her at the Meadows. They sent her off to another treatment centre to do a family program. She came back feeling even worse, And she started thinking, actually, I want to know what's going on. I want to know what's going on. And she managed to persuade them, to allow her to talk to some of the other patients who were having these difficulties. You also have people like Sharon Wakeshard-Cruz, who was a family therapist who studied under Virginia Satir, who was a big, well-known family therapist, who was also starting to think about, was really thinking about family systems. And family systems being the idea, if you think about the family like a mobile, it might hang above a child's cot, with little like butterflies or something, and each one is a member of the family, and it's all connected, and if you pull one, everything else shifts. Well, starting to suggest that, we shouldn't just see, it's very helpful to see addiction as something that's lodged in the individual, that the individual needs to take full responsibility for, because, we know victims don't recover, people need to get their acts together and say, look, this is me, I was powerless, I need to change. But actually, we also need to understand that there's a whole lot of pressure, on the identified patient, on the abuser from the family system. And Sharon Wakeshard-Cruz came up with some of the roles you probably would have heard about, the sort of rather classic roles that happen in families. She talks about the abuser, who is the addict, essentially. She talks about the enabler, who's very often partner of addict. She talks about the hero. She talks about the scapegoat. She talks about the mascot. She talks about the lost child. Are you familiar with some of those sort of roles? And she's suggesting that each of those roles plays a really important part, because actually the abuser, the addict in the family, what happens is everything becomes focused around them, and actually in some ways they can divert attention. The enabler's task is to reduce tension within the family, which gives a sense of stability. Then the hero, which is very often the first child, the task of the hero in the family is to actually make the family look absolutely okay. The hero tends to do very well. He gets a scholarship and captains the cricket team. That's the sort of hero that has the family being saying, well, look at us. Look, we've got, we must be doing something right because we've got our, all these A stars, whatever they are, at GCSE. This is all fine. Interestingly, the hero, so it's usually the first child and is the one most likely to become workaholic. The scapegoat is the family's sort of alter ego, the one who actually everyone can sort of blame, who just gets it wrong and can't do anything right. So all these different sorts of roles that play quite an important role. I mean, the scapegoat provides somebody to blame. That's what scapegoating is all about. The scapegoat tends to be the second child. The scapegoat is the one most likely to go on and be a substance misuser or abuser. The lost child. The lost child is the one who's no trouble to the family. Everything seems, just seems all right. Just gets on with it. Draws little pictures in the corner. Goes to school on time. Nothing remarkable. Again, plays a role in the family to make the family just thinking that we're okay. We've got a normal one. We've got one we don't have to worry about. Okay. Usually the middle or youngest child. Usually the one who goes on to have adult depression and anxiety, and usually the biggest codependent. And then the idea, Wakeshard-Cruz was talking about the idea of the mascot, who's the sort of the clown in the family, whose job in a way is to bring in a bit of sort of fun, and hilarity and laughter. And again, that is the child that usually goes on to have adult anxiety and depression. Now, this just doesn't describe all families, but it was a very useful idea that people have these roles, that they hang on the mobile. And if one person wants to change, not only do they have to find the strength in themselves to change, to pull that mobile, but they've got to push or pull against everyone else who wants everything to be held in place. Now, other people have gone on to talk about these things. We think about Robin Norwood, who wrote Women Who Love Too Much in the 80s. Robin Norwood was an addictions counsellor. Her job was to work with all the partners. What she realised is that actually, when she was in the room with an addict and his or her partner, she was in the room with two addicts. It was a pathological process. she focused very much on women at first, but actually when she later, a lot of men wrote in and said, you know, I identify with all this stuff. But Women Who Love Too Much, which is still a bestseller, you know, it is about, you know, it's about addiction, and that was very much about the codependent. We have other people. Melody Beattie in '87 wrote Codependent No More. First time that word is used to describe actually how you are around others, which is a link to Codependence Anonymous, the first step of which is we admitted we were powerless over others. Okay? We have Pierre Melody writing Facing Codependence at the end of the 80s in 1989. And it's the first time that actually codependence starts being talked about as being a consequence of childhood development. I'll talk some more about Pierre Melody. I think she's made a really good contribution, but it's a lot of people who've contributed. More people start writing about adult children of alcoholics. Janet, I never quite know how to pronounce this, Voigt or something like that, you may be familiar. And Charles Whitfield wrote a book on codependence. Bradshaw, John Bradshaw wrote a book on the family and family systems. These books starting to come out in the beginning of the 90s, but all based on, you know, books that were starting to be written in the 80s and based on the experience. It was a very exciting time, I think, the sort of late 70s and 80s for the addictions field, when there was these big changes. Claudia Black. Now, I think one of the interesting things is the National Association of Children of Alcoholics was formed. That was 1982. It had some big names, actually, as part of that. Wakeshadow Cruz, Raquel Lerner, who you might know about, has written a lot about. Raquel Lerner, I remember she said to me, she worked in Minnesota, she said there was a time in the 80s that if you opened the door for someone in Minnesota, they called you codependent. But you know, it's fun. Charles Whitfield, who wrote the book Codependence, Wakeshadow Cruz, Raquel Lerner, Stephanie Brown, who wrote a lot about ACOAs, they're really big. So the National Association of Children of Alcoholics, 1982. So big stuff. These, you know, so a lot there. Lots been done. Okay, let's keep going. So let's talk a bit more of a sort of detailed description, I guess, of codependency. So I'm suggesting to you that codependency is about this addiction to security. It's about managing anxiety by putting another person at ease, because if they're okay, I'm okay, or putting someone else at dis-ease, whereby I can explain my bad feelings through your bad behaviour. Okay? Here Melody, in all her work and her research, so she's conducting lots of interviews with all these people that are coming into the Meadows, asking lots of people, trying to make sense of her own experiences, came up with, in Facing Codependence, a list of 5 core symptoms of codependency, which you've probably seen. The first one is about self-esteem issues. It's saying that people with codependency have a core symptom around self-esteem issues. They have difficulty treating themselves as worthy, believing that they're worthy. They're very affected by other esteem. You know, the sort of people who, if they're going somewhere, you're invited for dinner, you take a box of chocolates or you know a bottle of wine or whatever it is, pathologically, because I'm not okay on my own, but does this make me okay? I don't want to, I don't want to knock social skills. I think it's nice if you come to dinner with me, you're welcome to bring something along. But, you know, it's I'm not enough on my own. It's the other esteem. It's the fact that, you know, I need to be, does this car make me better? Does this name dropping? You know, that's a classic one, you know. I'm okay, but, you know, I know so-and-so does that. Somehow that makes me better. Real issues around self-esteem. Now, I mean, bear in mind, and the researchers around this subject knew that the sort of things they were talking about with codependency were also in the general population. Okay, so we're not talking about something that's just around sort of addicted families, or indeed ill or distressed or dysfunctional families. Well, I think we are talking about something that's around dysfunctional families, but it's in the population. You know, having these issues around self-esteem, having large doses of shame and anxiety, you know, having those feelings is normal. The problem is there comes a critical point where you've got it at sort of volume 8, 9 or 10, where actually it affects functioning. And that's the point in which it starts becoming like a disease. So if you think about one of the symptoms of addictive disease or dependence, okay, one of the symptoms is it starts costing more than one can afford. It is. If you look in the manual, in the DSM-5, you know, in the American Psychiatric Association's manual, actually, one of the criteria is use despite knowledge that there are negative consequences. So there comes a critical point where actually having these feelings starts to actually mean that life is really quite dysfunctional, that we are not acting in our best interests, that we're not able to really hold ourselves in mind and take care of ourselves. So Pia Melody, self-esteem issues. The other one she identified, boundary issues. So boundary issues, two main sets of boundary issues. One is being able to sort of say no and stop people coming into our space, whether it's physical, sexual, or emotional. Being able to hold the boundary. If you like, being able to be a separate person. And this is key, and I'll come back to this, because actually the real damage through childhood development for people that suffer from codependency is they have not been able to individuate. They have not been able to feel comfortable being separate people. There is too much anxiety and shame attached to it. So it's very hard to hold boundaries. So typically, you see it, I suppose you see it a lot. We see it in the treatment field with partners of alcoholics. You realise, how much do you have to take, to stick around with all of this? We know actually in domestic abuse in this country, actually I think the figure is something like, I think you have to be on average beaten up 23 times before you ask for help. There's something about damaged people putting themselves in harm's way. So, so protecting self and boundaries also, so the boundaries with other people, being able to say no, and boundaries about, being able to be oneself. The third core symptom Pia Melody talks about is reality issues, the sort of knowing who I am, And again, you see that a lot with people in early recovery. What sort of clothes do I wear? What music do I listen to? My grandfather's died. How am I supposed to feel? A real loss of self. So real difficulties, owning realities. How do I feel? What do I really think about? What do I like? What I don't like? What do I look like is another one about realities. People not really being able to. I get this. I was talking to one of my children the other day about having grey hair, and Joe, who's 14, said, "Dad, you've got white hair." and I am constantly, I'll see a photograph of myself, I'm always rather shocked. It's definitely one of my sort of symptoms. But being able to see ourselves clearly. Now, of course, some of those things around eating disorders and body dysmorphia, we know that's a real big one. But actually it's around an awful lot, is actually just being able to see who we are, how we fit in, and who we are in the world. So we've got self-esteem, boundary issues, reality issues. The next one is like needs and wants, being able to express needs and wants and actually manage needs and wants. That fourth one is about self-care. Being able to take care of self. So that we see that, and you see it around the other addictions. You see people, they can go out and buy a flashy car, they actually can't take themselves and to go to the dentist. Being able to really just take care of one's own needs and wants. And the fifth symptom is moderation, being able to express oneself moderately, says Pia Melody. That's her word, moderation. For me, that's about black and white thinking. It's about the difficulty that people who have codependence have in the sort of right or wrong. You're either with me or you're against me. It's the catastrophic thinking. It's not just going to go wrong, it's going to go completely wrong.
Yeah.
Do you know? It's about right or wrong. That you see, I do a lot of couple therapy. When couples come into the room, the one thing they really want to know at the beginning of couples therapy is, can you please, Mr. Therapist, decide which one of us is right and which one is who's the baddie here? And actually, it's quite frustrating when you tell them they got into a muddle and it's Snow White never goes the big bad wolf, and actually you're 50% responsible for what's happened. It's quite difficult. So there's an awful lot, an awful difficulty with moderation. And out of that comes all the other sort of stuff. The overdeveloped sense of responsibility, criticism as a threat, is a big one. I'm quite interested. One of the things I've enjoyed doing in my work recently is having a good look at what the anthropologists have to say about some of the things that we do. because so much of what we do goes back to the savannah. And I was quite, so this criticism as a threat is an interesting, because you probably know that, I mean, if I was rude to you, and I was also very charming and polite and affirmed you, actually I would need to affirm you about 5 times more than being rude to you for you to sort of feel even. You know, it hurts much more to receive a criticism. You know, you can't have a criticism and then a praise. It doesn't work like that. You need to have a criticism and about 5 praises. And it's just like that. So I thought, what's all that about? And what the anthropologists have to say, interestingly, is it goes back to the savannah, where actually it was really important that the brain learned from bad experiences. Because actually, if you didn't learn when you eat those red berries, you know, you're going to die, you know, the species isn't going to survive. So actually, it was much more important that we learned that don't eat the berries, they're going to kill you, than it was eat the honey, it tastes yummy. Do you know? So there was something about the brain there on the savannah learning. It's more important. So we've been selected to learn from bad experiences, but it does mean that actually we're a bit prone to be far more sensitive when somebody's rude to us than sort of joyful when somebody's very kind to us. A bit of an aside, but I think it's quite interesting. Okay? And all these issues, you know, when it comes to relationships, all these problems, you know, with boundaries and stuff, are also really difficult because the couple relationship is all about boundaries, isn't it? It's once you meet up and you get past the merging stage, it's all about boundaries, isn't it? Well, who goes to bed when? Do I have to go and visit your parents? Who does the cleaning up? Is it okay if I put my cup in the sink and not in the dishwasher, which is the big thing that you hear in the couple. And it is the men who put the cups in the sink, as you in the zone, that's what they say. Put it in the zone, it's not in the dishwasher, but it's in the zone. But, you know, so all these things, so it really affects, so all this stuff really affects the way we interact with other people. Also, of course, for relationships, one of the key things about relationships is being able to be individual. In order to be one, you need to be two. That's the truth of it in the couple relationship. In order to be attractive, I often say this, if in couples therapy, if you ask couples when they find the other attractive, and this is after the first sort of year to 18 months of the relationship in which whatever they do is attractive, okay? I love the way she bites her toenails, which after about 18 months is disgusting, but in the first 18 months is just wonderful. She does it in such a nice way. But when you ask couples about when do they find the other attractive, what they'll say to you is they'll describe a situation where the other is being separate. I went to his office and he was giving a talk. And he was with his colleagues and he didn't see me, and I saw him, and I don't usually see him like that. Actually, it really turned me on. You know, I saw her doing her work, she didn't know. I saw her in the garden of the children, I came home, she was in the garden of the children playing, and she didn't know I could see her. It was just it's when they're doing something separate. It's really, really important, this. Because actually, unless you can be two, you can't be one. And so, and that's why relationships the relationships are difficult for everybody anyway, we know that, but why they are so difficult for people with addictions or people who've come from this, I'm going to have to keep going on, because I've got a sense of only been talking a few minutes. It's 40 minutes or something. Am I making some sense?
Yes.
Okay?
Fantastic.
Jolly good, thank you very much. It's always quite good to know that. Okay, let's do child development. Where does it all come from? So you get a sense of what codependence is about. Where does it come from? Because you know what? There's always a story. Where there's a void, there's a story. This doesn't come from nowhere. Okay? We know... Where should we start? What can we tell you? Okay. Those of you, the therapists, the thing that tends to excite therapists most these days is what's called attachment theory, developed by a guy called John Bowlby and then by lots of other people who have done some really good work with it all. But attachment theory is something that right now, nowadays is very, very obvious, but in the 50s and stuff when they were doing all of this wasn't quite so obvious, and it had an enormous impact actually on the way that children were treated in things like hospitals and things like that. But attachment theory is the acknowledgement that there's a biological process inside all of us that motivates us to seek proximity to our caregivers in order to not be harmed, to stay safe, to stay warm, to be fed. You know, attachment theory is what is what explains, when ducklings are separated from their, from their mother, they make a hell of a noise. When cats or kittens or, and there's the equally children, etc. We have something in us as mammals that motivates us to seek proximity to our caregivers. Okay? We know that that's the case. We also know that the human brain starts working before it's built. Unlike a computer that comes loaded with an operating system, the problem with the human brain is it starts working before it's built. So actually, experience is the architect of the brain. We have over 100 billion neurons at birth waiting to make connections based entirely on experience. Okay? So experience is the architect of the brain. So what happens to us around our sort of attachments, our early attachments, and at all different stages during child development, it's a much bigger deal what happens in the pre-verbal stage. Pre-verbal meaning the part of your life where actually things are remembered but they can't be recalled. But actually also, attachments carry on through, we know that now, through, through teenage. And sometimes those of you who've got adult children think that maybe they're still our children when they come and move home in the mid-20s or something like that. But it's around all the time, this sort of attachment stuff. Now, how we attach is a really big part. Now, different things affect attachment. Most people are born into a more or less, neurotic or dysfunctional family. They just sort of are. If you're born into a family where there is addictions, if you're born into a family where there's illness, particularly mental illness, but sometimes also physical illnesses, if you're born into those sorts of families, actually the needs of the child very often come second. The needs of the adults come over and above the needs of the child. Right. And I guess what we get from all of that, is the beginning of shame and the beginning of anxiety. Because actually if dad's drinking, or mum's taking drugs, or dad's hitting mum, or mum has some bipolar disorder, if there's something rather major going on, then the needs of the child tend to come second. And actually two things start to happen. Freud talked about His Majesty the baby. The self-centered child, up until the age of 7, thinks that pretty much everything that happens is about me. That's just how it is. The brain isn't big enough. It's still it's building itself while it's working. It's all about me. So you start to get a feeling that if something's wrong and it's not safe, you get the beginning of anxiety. I don't feel secure, it's not safe. And you get the beginning of shame. I think it's my fault, there's something wrong with me. The beginning of shame that in adult life, really manifests is not worthy. Who do you think you are? And an anxiety that has people feeling like, I can't be myself. Because if I was myself in my childhood and it wasn't all right, I need to be someone else. So the human infant starts to adapt. That's why we're top of the food chain. We start to adapt in order to survive. Now, other things happen actually during the course of failed attachment. All sorts of stuff, particularly early on. So, we know about mother-infant bonding, but this continues through. It's not just about sort of early bonding. Failed mother-infant bonding is associated with reduced serotonin, which is the brain chemical that actually makes you feel right. It's the one that the antidepressant drugs try and produce more of. And it's associated with increased adrenaline and increased cortisol. And people with increased high levels of adrenaline and cortisol tend to, rather than you'd think that if you had lots of adrenaline and cortisol, you try and do things to calm yourself down, they tend to actually do things that increase even more and give you even more adrenaline and cortisol. It's why actually stimulant addicts, the cocaine addicts, you sort of think if you were a cocaine addict, you'd take something that would tranquilise you. But they don't. But if you were a speedy person, you wouldn't take the cocaine. You'd take something that tranquilised you. But actually what we know is that speedy people take sort of speed. They did it. There was a really good. I had somebody telling me about they had a baseball match. I think I wouldn't call it round, but it was at the Metaphor Clinic, and they had the heroin addicts against the cocaine addicts. It was quite marked.
Charging around the field.
And you know, the heroin addicts were sort of having a little sniff and hanging out and still be really happy. There's quite a bit of stuff, you know, about different people, different drugs. But interestingly, people tend to take the drugs they've actually, you know, sort of increased where they're coming from. But shame and anxiety, I guess the important thing to say about shame is, you know what shame is, and distinguished from guilt. You know, shame is a focus on self, I am bad, and whereas guilt is actually I've done bad. You know, it's a focus on sort of on behaviour, and an important thing. And actually, shame really correlates with addictions, suicide, bullying, violence, depression, and anxiety. There's a strong correlation. Interestingly, guilt inversely correlates with those things. The capacity in which you can do guilt tends to inversely correlate. All of this, I guess what we end up with, maybe this is what's important. What we end up in, I mean, the thing is about childhood development is that we have only one experience of childhood. There isn't really anything to sort of compare it to, okay? So we end up with a whole lot of beliefs about ourselves. So when I talk about shame and feeling I'm not worthy, or the world's not a safe place, a lot of that is actually quite unconscious. Certainly, you're not going to get a child who says, "Oh, Dad, I'm not feeling very worthy." It doesn't happen like that. It is what you call, it's what, for the therapist, Bolas would call an unthought known, what for the Shapiro and EMDR or the CBTers would call a negative cognition. It is, but an unthought known is a nice phrase. So it's something that we know, but we don't know we know. It's held in the limbic system, okay? It's held in the limbic system. The limbic system is the part of the brain that actually that deals with fight and flight. It's the part of the brain that kicks in nanoseconds before the frontal cortex. It does all the sort of thinking. So actually, you know, which is why if you say to a depressed person, pull your socks up, or come on, think of all the poor starving people, it's why it doesn't work. Because actually what's happening for them has trumped the cognition. It might be able to think of, you know, how lucky they might be and how grateful they should be. They've been trumped by the limbic system that says, no, my belief is that I'm not good enough. Okay? It's really there. And it has its extreme, some people feeling that they're in two minds. I've had people in the consulting room asking if they're schizophrenic, which actually is probably the best way of diagnosing that they're not. Because nobody who's schizophrenic can ask you that question. But it feels like that somehow they are, because it's part of them knows one thing, you know, but actually there's another part of them knows the other. They know that somehow what they're doing or how they're thinking is a bit screwed up, but it's so powerful and it's taking over. Very quickly, the important thing, the reason I mentioned attachment, is because actually we have to, as children, as young children, we need to form attachments from which we individuate, from which we then learn to separate safely. You know, so if we develop well, we attach, we feel safe, we have what Bowlby called the secure base, from which we can move on and individuate and become ourselves. Now the difficulty in dysfunctional families is three things happen. One is that you get people who never attached. Now, think about, this is why the adoptees are so overrepresented, because there was no attachment, there was just relinquishment from the beginning, okay? Often multiple relinquishments. So if you haven't attached, you don't go through that, you don't actually learn to move on from that to really safely individuate. Because actually you're still trying to wait to attach. Because there's something about our brains that sees things developmentally. We can't take ourselves to a later point in the development if another bit's got a bit fucked up earlier on. We're forever trying to get back, let's get that bit right, and then we can move on. Which is partly why also the notion of repetition compulsion, it's a psychodynamic term, but the part that, if we think damaged people put themselves in harm's way continually, do you know, you meet people who say, gosh, it's yet another unavailable girlfriend or boyfriend. Do you know, one is an accident, two maybe a coincidence, three is a habit. Do you know, when that sort of thing starts happening? It's because actually we're trying to, in a way, we're forever trying to play the game again, but this time to win. I need to go back. I want to tame the wild beast because then I can move on. I I need to make the unavailable available. So there are those that never attach and therefore can't individuate. There are those that have had, who weren't allowed to separate, often those that had narcissistic parents. And there's a lot of literature at the moment about co-narcissism. I don't know if you're aware about that, but it's really interesting. Because the narcissist cannot see the significant other is separate, because everything is about me. It's all about, everything's connected to me. Well, if you're the child of the narcissist, you learn to not be able to see yourself as separate. So if you like, the narcissistic parent can't see the child as separate from self, the child can't see self as separate from other. And actually, so it's an extreme form of codependence that if you follow then the myth about Narcissus and Echo, that Narcissus fell in love with his reflection in the pond, how he looked. He needed to look good. He didn't fall in love with himself. He fell in love with how he looked in his reflection. And Echo, who was massively obsessed with Narcissus, was forever going through the woods just calling out his name. And so you get the codependent with a narcissistic wound that actually becomes a co-narcissist. And they really put themselves in harm's way. They really, really do. And the third disrupted attachment is the one where actually you attach, but actually individuating, something goes wrong. Now, very often this is the one that happens around chronic illness or psychiatric illness in the family. There's an awful lot of boarding school survivors. I think 3% of the British population went to boarding school. Actually, they're far more they're really overrepresented in treatment programs. I don't know about fellowships in general. Again, all the sort of confusions. And I think for them, a lot of people, because they're having to manage the confusion of, I'm privileged, but I'm not with my mum. And the sense of, and how can I complain because I'm being told I'm having a good education, but I'm 7 years old and suddenly I'm spending half the year away from, And it's very difficult for these people to acknowledge, but it's quite a movement actually around boarding. It's an interesting term, boarding school survivor, because it's quite hard to sort of say, because you think for me it sort of sounds like it's privileged, but actually I think it correlates a lot with workaholism and it correlates with the chemical addictions. I suspect it correlates with the sex and drug addiction too, and the self-soothing that's needed when you have sudden abandonment. It's another thing, another topic we can lecture on here maybe, I reckon. You okay for another sort of 10 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, you were going to talk on, you attach when, by individuating something goes wrong. You didn't explain that.
Okay, I'll have a go and I'm sorry if that wasn't clear.
That.
But to become an individual, as a human being, a separate person who can feel confident on his or her own and say, this is who I am and this is how I feel, this is what I like, this is what I don't like, here are my boundaries. To do that, you have to have a good attachment, okay? And so things go wrong at different stages. Some people just don't attach at all, and therefore they can't individuate. Some people have a disrupted sort of an attachment. And some people are just attached but aren't allowed to separate. Those are the ones who have children of narcissists. Sorry if that's not clear. The problem is I spend all day doing this sort of thing. I don't think people know what I'm talking about. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about let's link it all to addiction quickly. Think about the language of addiction. We talk about, don't we? We talk about a fix, we talk about drowning our sorrows, we talk about getting out of it. What we know about addiction is that it's genetically proposed, it's environmentally disposed, it begins with a pursuit of pleasure, it continues with an escape from reality, it costs more than we can afford, it's self-seeking, it's self-serving, it's anti-intimacy. And it's fueled by shame and anxiety. So again, think about the general population. Everybody has some shame and anxiety, but people with codependency who have bucket loads of this. And for most people, many codependents will actually come across their addiction, if you like, won't seem so obvious. But I think, that's why I liked what Robin Norwood was doing. The idea that if you're with a couple, for example, in a room, and one is an addict, so is the other, and you need to really think about that, because very often what happens is that one the abuser wears the addiction on his or her sleeve, and it's plain to see, so that the other can keep his or hers tucked up her sleeve. Okay? And that's the bit about codependency when I say to you it's about regulating anxiety, it's about the search for security by putting the other at dis-ease. In those situations, the amount of times I've seen people saying that when he or she goes into treatment, everything's going to be okay. If only he or she will stop doing what he or she has been doing, everything will be all right. You're a couple of weeks into treatment, the partner goes into withdrawal and starts thinking of good reasons why he or she could come out of treatment. Yeah? So there's something there about the need to have somebody explaining, you know, I've got a whole bunch of bad feelings, I don't want to look at them as being mine. You know, so if you just keep acting out, thanks very much, because of course I feel like this, because you're doing this, that, or the other. You know, that's the other side of codependence. That I think a lot of codependents don't like. A lot of codependents like to think of themselves as, actually, I'm just very nice. It's sort of Mother Teresa-ish sort of people. But you know, it's never about that. Codependence is about managing the anxiety by putting the other at ease. I had it, people come into the consulting room with me, you know, there's a few people I can think of, you know, they'll sit down, how was your week, Paul? How are you doing? What did you do at the weekend? You know, stuff. And I always think, well, very nice of you to ask me how I feel, because you're paying. But actually, what they're doing, at some point we have to say, look, this is nice, and I don't want to knock social skills, but you know what they're really doing? They're just trying to manage their anxiety by just putting me at ease. You know, that's the need. To the extent to which they could spend 10 minutes of their, you know, that session doing that. Actually, I wouldn't really get away with 10 minutes. But it's quite, it's just important to be able to see that stuff. Managing anxiety by putting others at ease. Okay, and of course addiction, but it's far more than alcohol and drugs, isn't it? So the process, let's not forget the process addictions. Let's not, you know, forget about, you know, the eating disorders. So we know about anorexia, the managing of anxiety by controlling what comes in or out. You know, that people get really high on, the compulsive overeating and the filling of the void and the keep on the loss of control, the bulimia that swings between the two, the orthorexia, which is the biggest eating disorder in this country, which you probably may or may not know about. Orthorexia is the unhealthy obsession with healthy eating. Actually, I brought my own food with me if it's okay, and no, I cannot have 10 almonds, it's got to be 9 almonds on my porridge, okay? It's about managing anxiety and control. It's slightly socially sanctioned, and the industry and the food industry makes millions out of all of this, you know, this stuff. But it's about managing anxiety by what goes in, the unhealthy obsession with healthy eating, and that one, orthorexia sadly is not in the classification of diseases yet, but it must get there soon. The financial addictions, the gambling, the debting, the spending and the under-earning, compulsive spending and shopping. Under-earning is an interesting one. It's about people who actually earn less than they deserve. It's about the overqualified. It's about the Oxford graduate who works as a secretary all their lives. Yeah? I cannot actually make myself sort of visible. The problem with under-earning is at some point you'll end up in debt. In the same way the problem with spending is at some point you'll end up in debt. And the gambling is part of the financial addictions. What else can we talk about? Sex and love addictions. Big things for the love addict, the hunger for attachment that has people, you know, doing whatever it takes in order to keep connected, to hang on to, you know, to manage anxiety by staying connected. It tolerates all sorts of bad behaviour as long as we can be together, you know, as long as we can be together. The sex addictions, which is so much about changing the way one feels through the adrenaline, through sexual behaviour, as well as all the issues around orgasm. The sexual addiction, there's so many different manifestations of it all. In short, the sex addicts offer love to get sex, the love addicts offer sex to get love. It's the sort of short of all of that. The work addictions, Workaholics Anonymous, all that sort of stuff. Again, a lot of these fellowships were formed from people who'd stopped using alcohol and drugs and realised that there's an addiction interaction, that other things start happening. Work addiction is an interesting one. It's the only one that's socially sanctioned and actually financially rewarding. It's the one that you can wear as a badge of honour. You know, it's the one, if I said to you, I was up last night and I was writing all of this stuff, you know, and I was just working really hard because I had a really hard day, and you'd probably think, oh, cool. If I said, you know, actually I was up last night looking at porn on the computer, it would be very different, wouldn't it? Or, you know, I was stuffing, I ate my third packet of McVitie's, you know. So, you know, it's a difficult one. And work addiction isn't about work, by the way. It's about managing anxiety by keeping busy. So an awful lot of work addicts aren't actually that productive because they can't keep still. It's also an interesting one because it's, in a way, it's a substance misuse disorder. It's about a process and an addiction, the adrenaline that goes with work addiction, you know, that so fuels things, alongside the management of anxiety by busyness, the compulsion towards busyness. So all of these things. We've then got the other things that seem like addictions, but nobody's really properly calling themselves addictions at the moment. So the ones that we might call the dysfunctions. Perfectionism is a classic. The managing of shame and anxiety by trying to be perfect, you know, which you never get there. Perfectionism drives you mad. It's like drinking seawater to quench your thirst. You keep doing it, but you never get there. I've got to get it right, because then I'll be enough, and the world will be a safe place. Very painful. It's a symptom of codependency, but an addiction itself for many people. The fantasy addictions that form obsessions around if only I was with him or her, or if only I had this amount of money. You know, the fantasy addictions are all about if only and when. Now they also interact. For the love addicts, the fantasy addictions are of Prince Charming or Princess Charming. You know, it's there. For the debtors, it's about if only I won the lottery. You know. But they become quite addictive processes where people avoid reality by staying in those addictions. And some of the other dysfunctions, the hoarding and the pathological collecting, you know, which again are about just managing, trying to be secure, making sure that we've just got absolutely everything we need, because you never know when you might need that sixth TV set. You know. So, you know, all of that stuff. Still going? Still with me?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much, because it's taken a long way. It feels like 5 minutes, but it's been nearly an hour. Okay, let's start talking about a bit of a sort of solution, I suppose. So there's a whole lot of stuff. I mean, I hope it's making some sense. But you know, the general gist is that codependency is the disease. I love that phrase, the disease behind the disease. You know, as my colleague, my colleague psychiatrist Georgina Wilson said, it's the point that you get to when you've put down the drugs and the other processes. You know, I think that stuff is so important, the disease behind the disease. You know, but it's about managing anxiety by trying to put others at ease or dis-ease. It's about an addiction to security. It's not about being nice. It's not about people pleasing. It's about a loss of self. It's about losing self to the extent that I don't know what I want, I don't know how I feel, I have doubts about how worthy I am, I can't connect in a relationship, I cannot be myself. You know, it's about being unable to connect. So the thing about recovery is that one thing we know is recovery needs a safe place. People get ill in relationships. You know, if you think about codependencies, people getting ill in family systems. If you get ill in relationships, actually it makes sense that you might get well in relationships. You need safe relationships. And bear in mind the capacity for damaged people to put themselves in harm's way. Okay? So, you know, this relationship has to be really think carefully, and I think that's why actually the group therapy movement and the 12-step movement has been so successful, really, because it has all the ingredients, of healing, a sense of universality. I'm not the only one. A place where you can learn and hear that others are further down the journey than you. A place where you can have an unconditional positive regard, where someone can say, "I get you." You know, it needs a safe place. Alice Miller, who wrote the drama of Being a Child, another big bestseller. I think that probably came out in the 80s as well, actually. I bet it did, along with all those other things. Although I don't think she knew who Pia Melody was. She talked about people needing what she called an enlightened witness. I quite like that expression. Someone who can just hear, not someone to fix you, because it takes real courage to be with someone and not fix them, doesn't it? It takes real courage to just sit and let somebody be. And that's so often what we want, because it's a basic human need. You know, it's to be known and understood, not to be ordered around and told what to do. You know, but you have to do a lot of work on yourself. You have to do a lot of work on yourself. Brené Brown, more recently writing about this stuff, she's taken up the mantle really. She's a professor of social work in the States, and I guess because of that kudos, she did one of the TED Talks, which if you haven't seen, have a look, it's 20 minutes long. She was an addictions counsellor actually at one time, and she's doing a lot to put this stuff sort of on the map. But she talks about how important it is to be able to be vulnerable, to do what never felt safe. Because actually, if you can't be vulnerable, you won't be visible. And so many people with codependence have visibility issues. And I see it so often. And they end up, the Oscar they get is the best supporting actor or actress. They can never quite do it themselves because somehow I would stand out, and standing out would be awful because being me is not okay. It was too much shame and anxiety. And they're the people that see everyone else have a great idea, don't do anything about it, and see someone else capitalise on it. Yeah? They cannot be vulnerable. If you read the biographies of people, like Richard Branson's biography, he has had there have been more start-ups that haven't worked out than there have been successes, because actually he's just prepared to get up and do it again. So you've got to have courage to be vulnerable, but God, that takes a lot, and you really need some help and some coaching. So I think that people in recovery, they need some education, perhaps a bit like what I'm trying to do here. Their information is out there. You need to understand that codependency comes from somewhere. It's not nonsense. It has a story. It has a development. You need to understand about that that it's normal, that it's no fault. But that actually you need to understand that it can be changed, but it takes real perseverance. And it takes a perseverance in a family system, not just, so back to the mobile, not just the perseverance from you, but the perseverance to push against those who don't want you to change. The mum who doesn't want you to be successful because if you are, it might show her up. So it takes takes a lot. We also need to be able to get to know ourselves. Mary Main, who worked with John Bowlby, did a lot of research on attachment theory. She says that the emotional well-being of a child is 75% dependent on the mother being able to tell what she described as an emotionally coherent story of her life. If the parent knows themselves, actually the children are in with the best chance. And in fact, we know this about child development. The real cradle in child development is actually the couple relationship and how well they, and how well they put through their stuff. So knowing an emotionally coherent story, often best developed with others. And there are lots of techniques in treatment, and we do a lot of drawing, a lot of art therapy, getting people to draw pictures of their childhoods, simply because pictures tend not to lie. Sometimes the codependent can say, actually, Dad used to beat up Mum, and actually I was abused a few times, actually, but it was okay. It was all right. They can really, because there's nothing to really compare it. If they heard someone else say it, they'd think this is outrageous, but for them it wasn't okay. So sometimes pictures that people do without thinking are great. And you get some real classic pictures. Someone does a picture, you give them the task reset is do a picture of your childhood well. Actually, you get some, and I'm trying not to be any more specific than that. And people will come back, and you suddenly realize they haven't put themselves in it. But it did. It did fascinate me. Where are we? Pictures, no send letters. Those things can be really useful. Writing letters particularly to parents that you're never going to send, that are going to say, actually, if you could say what you really wanted to say without worrying about it. It's just a good way to get in touch with what was happening. Quite hard for people to do. Again, that's the idea. We're just trying to build up this emotionally coherent story. We need to know ourselves. As well as having this information, we need to know ourselves. Back to Brené Brown, being vulnerable, really understanding that vulnerability is not a weakness. Actually, what she says is that if you stay small and under the radar, if you get the Oscar for the best supporting actress, you're never going to you're never going to be creative. You're never going to innovate. Actually, you're not going to get the success that you want. Being vulnerable is a prerequisite for innovation, creativity, and success. It really is. But it means going against everything, inside. So it takes a real effort, which is why I think fellowship is important, and probably why the emphasis on prayer is important, and the notion of a higher power. You need some help to do something that we cannot do on our own. The limbic therapies is the other thing around, a little plug, I suppose, for psychotherapy. I think psychotherapy on its own isn't actually that good for codependence. It's standard psychotherapy. You certainly need to form a relationship, but it's not just about understanding. Sure, bringing things from unconscious into conscious is really important to understand processes, but real change, because this damage is early and developmental, and this damage is lodged in the limbic system, psychotherapy tends mostly to be frontal cortex to frontal cortex sitting in the room, okay? It's quite logical, it's cognitive, it makes sense, you can understand, but some of you will know that sometimes it just doesn't quite get there, particularly if it's in for some of the early wounds. I think it's a big, big part of it, but there's a lot of research now into the therapies that work on the limbic system where trauma is stored, and a lot of therapies that work with the body. Peter Levine, is it Peter? I always want to call him Stephen, I think he's a record producer. Yeah. Peter Levine, in the States, writes quite a bit about this. I think his book's called something like Waking the Tiger or something, if anyone knows. Anyway, very big on somatic experiencing and body work and things, and trying to help move things around the body. Because actually, interestingly, as people get into recovery, as they give up all their process addictions and face their codependence, in the first year of recovery, there's quite a lot of clinical information to tell us that people get ill. Sex and love addiction, people get very ill. The financial addictions, people tend to get a lot of anxiety, a lot of chest anxieties. So they make a commitment, when I'm going to start looking after myself, I'm going to give up the fantasy, someone's going to rescue me, I'm going to face the fact that I'm overspending. And people get into that, and I've seen quite healthy people in their sort of 30s think, I'm going to have a heart attack. I think I'm going to have to call an ambulance. Because there's something about the anxiety that moves away from the process and comes back home, if you like, to the body. So the body and the mind are massively connected. The other limbic therapies, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, a bit of a mouthful, but very good clinical evidence for turning down the volume on the negative cognitions, the unthought knowns, the I'm not worthy, if I say how I feel, something awful is going to happen, the sort of things that regulate so many people from the limbic systems, even though they know that actually, why should something, what could possibly happen? But somehow the limbic system is saying, red alert, danger, danger. The other therapy that works on the limbic system is equine-assisted psychotherapy. I'm a fan, we do that too, as well as EMDR. And I was really sceptical. I went out about 10 years ago, I went out to Arizona to visit the sort of three then, they call it the Arizona model. It's the Minnesota model in 12-step treatment, and the Arizona model, which is one integrating some of these things. I was invited out there, and I think they thought I was going to refer people out there. But and I had an experience to sort of put in the menage with a few horses to do equine-assisted psychotherapy. And I thought this is just a sexy add-on to sort of get people to come here, pat a horse or something. And actually, I had a very powerful experience. And my wife has horses, and actually, and we had them and developed, and anyway ended up training as equine-assisted psychotherapists. And horses I hadn't realised, are experts at reading body languages. They have, compared to us, they have the brain the size of a walnut. The difference between them and us is they use all of theirs. And they are very good at telling you how you feel, and very good at picking up emotions. And I've seen some fascinating things happening and healing take place because it's limbic to limbic. It's limbic to limbic. It's nothing cognitive about it. It's experiential. And the horses, because that's what horses do. They're not processed. It's all about it's all about feelings. So I'm a big fan of that. I think it's going to be very hard to get the NHS to fund that. We had that. I was clinical director at CrossFit Centre in Antigua. It was pretty hard to get people to send people out from Europe. So when little Johnny says, "I think I'm going to go to Antigua for my treatment," parents say, "We've heard that before. We're going to pay for you to go to the Caribbean." Anyway. Made sense to enough of you?
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully you've heard it, and I managed to I just couldn't possibly, not the microphone, I couldn't do it that way. I hope it's made sense. I feel really passionate about this stuff. I think it's such an exciting time. I'm completely caught up with America, American treatment here in the UK, and I think we know that we are slightly different, that is the truth. We are different. We don't do the big interventions that they're doing. I don't think we ever will. We need to understand this stuff. the Brits have contributed massively to if you think about AA, the whole development of AA, the Oxford movement that informed the AA, Carl Jung, who said to the early alcoholics, the only way you'll get well is through a spiritual awakening. We've had a big a big impact, and we need to hold on to that, and there is help here. But you know what? It takes courage. It takes courage. It takes doing what it's never felt safe to do. Get the help of other people. And I rest my case. Thank you.